Okay. Okay. I think we can now officially start. Now we are really ready. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Our speaker is Kate Vredenburgh. She's the associate professor from the Department of Philosophy, Logic, and Scientific Method from London School of Economics. Her specialization lies in philosophy of social science, political philosophy, and philosophy of AI. And she currently have a project on future work, and I think she's going to share some preliminary results from this project with us today. So join me in welcoming Kate.
Thank you. Thank you for the patience. Sorry, I can't give talks. I could give talks sitting down. So if you can't hear me online, please notify us and I'll sit down closer to the microphone. Thank you all for your patience. Thank you for attending. So, as Yingtong said, I'm a philosopher at the LSE. My work so far has mainly been kind of straightforward philosophy. This talk is a kind of combination of philosophy and qualitative methods. I'm very keen on your feedback. I'm very keen, so we've done a kind of pilot in the UK. I'm very keen to kind of do this across different geographies. So thinking about Germany, hopefully Taiwan, hopefully Japan. So your feedback will be very helpful in shaping that. I'm very happy for you to ask questions of clarification as I'm speaking. So yeah, if you want kind of clarification on something I've said, please just raise your hand. And if it's difficult to hear me, also raise your hand and let me know. Okay. So this is work that's funded by the UK Research and Innovation Council. The LSE has also given some funding, and it's co-authored with Marco Meyer, my co-author, who's at the University of Hamburg, who has training as a philosopher and then also as an economist. So I got interested in this project partly because I got interested in how social scientists think about autonomy. So across the social sciences, sociology, organizational studies, management studies, autonomy is often conceptualized as worker control. And in particular, it's broken down into discretion over how you do tasks, work scheduling, as well as kind of where you work and when you start and stop work. The idea is you're highly autonomous if you can tell your boss, I need to stop at 4 p.m. in order to pick up my child. If you can say, I choose the order in which I write the sections of a paper, if you can choose what to work on, your kind of goal, all of these are signs of autonomy. And oftentimes in these literatures, autonomy is seen as instrumentally valuable, so not really as important for its own sake, but important for the well-being of the worker. So, for example, in one tradition, autonomy is conceptualized as a kind of job resource that can promote well-being in the face of job demand. So if your boss is like, you have to work 18 hours a day, and then you have some control over that, you can say, no, I choose only to work 8 hours a day. That helps your well-being. Pretty straightforward, I think. So I think that this conceptualization is limited for at least 3 reasons. One, I think that control is already a kind of operationalization of what autonomy is. So as a social scientist, right, you need to take these big background fuzzy concepts like well-being or autonomy, then you need to operationalize them in a way that actually you could come up with a construct to measure the concept that you're interested in. And I think that's what social scientists have done here. So control seems to me like something that you can, in principle, measure, you could try to operationalize, but it's just one way of making autonomy more specific, easier to measure, but I think it loses out on a lot. So, for example, you might think, well, We think of being autonomous as being something like self-directed or self-governing. We need control for that, but autonomy is not the same as control. So think about the following little example. It may resonate with anyone who's a director or head of department. So let's imagine that Ade is a tenured professor who's named head of the department. Arguably, she has more control over departmental affairs. Does that mean she has more autonomy? No, you might think she feels very responsible to her colleagues, right? She's not choosing her own end. She's not really self-directed. She has a lot of control, but it's for the sake of other people, or it's for the sake of sort of making the university run well. So here we might say there's an example where there's a lot of control, but there's not a lot of autonomy. Control is kind of helpful for autonomy, or maybe it's even necessary, but we need some other ingredients. And kind of relatedly, I think that control is really imperfectly valuable for autonomy. There'll be some cases in which control kind of promotes autonomy, and some cases in which kind of orthogonal to the question of whether you have autonomy or doesn't really help you. So a kind of similar example, let's imagine Abdul, he works as a research assistant for a notoriously hard to please professor. Nobody knows any of those types of people, but just imagine there's this professor, really hard to please, right? Abdul is always bringing the professor the work, and the professor saying, not good enough, not good enough. But, right, the professor gives Abdul just total control, right? Over Abdul can choose his work method, schedule, aims even. But Abdul spends every moment at work really thinking, what will the professor think about what I'm doing? And will the professor judge it to be correct? And he moderates his behavior accordingly. I think in this kind of example, we might judge Abdul does not have a high degree of autonomy, even though in some ways he has a lot of control. And so you might say, and I think this is often what happens in the use of AI in the workplace and so-called algorithmic management, where people are constantly surveilled. They know that some surveillance system is watching them, but they don't know how they're being judged. And they're not being ordered moment to moment, like do this now, do this now, do this now. But they feel like they have this loss of agency because of this kind of constant monitoring and evaluation. Finally, and this is kind of what we're testing in this pilot study, I hypothesize that this idea of autonomy as control is insufficiently responsive to what workers care about and to other meanings of autonomy that are related to AI-driven changes. So I already spoke to this with the example of surveillance and algorithmic management. But you might say, well, maybe we also need to bring in approaches in the social sciences that also look at, for example, worker voice and worker input as part of measuring autonomy. So look at, do workers have a say in changes in the workplace, so-called worker voice? Do they have control over how AI is being adopted? Do they have some kind of input? And like I said, we see these threats like surveillance or opacity, where workers don't know how they're being judged or why they're being ordered to do what they're due, that you might say are threats to autonomy, but don't necessarily go by way of loss. Feel free to push back on all of this in the Q&A, but this was my kind of starting point of dissatisfaction for these exclusively control-based theories. So I had this question, what should replace or supplement autonomy as control? And especially interested in contexts in which AI is being used at work. Now, you know, often in the past, I would have gone away and read what Philip Pettit said about republicanism, and read what the socialists said, and read what else. But I thought it would be helpful, right, to kind of theorize about this, interview workers about how is AI impacting their jobs, and then what is their conception of autonomy, and see what we can pull out of it. All right. So in the talk today, I'll talk a little bit about how I think this might lead to some philosophical results. I don't have that yet. I have a kind of just empirical pilot, but how we might use this to theorize philosophically. Then I'll talk about the pilot setup. Then I'll talk through some preliminary results. Then I'm actually going to talk about 3 more things. So some kind of ethical questions, some methodological questions, and then some questions about the experimental design. All right. And again, please, any questions of clarification? All right. So Nomi Arkeli, in her article entitled "Which Autonomy?" goes through many of the different kinds of conceptions that are associated with this concept autonomy. I've just picked out some that I think might be relevant to the workplace, but she lists even more than this. One, we might call someone autonomous if they have a high degree of self-control, if they're able to kind of control their own impulses, desires. Second, we might say autonomy is a matter of having power in the world. So you might say, I'm more autonomous than someone else. If I can accomplish more of my goals, I have more power to do things. We also talk about someone being autonomous in a kind of epistemic sense, if they have an independence of mind. So think about calling someone an independent thinker. We also talk about an idea of moral autonomy, quite a weighty, very kind of content-heavy notion. So the idea that you're autonomous if you can kind of reflect on your own motivations and endorse them perhaps as things that everyone ought to do in your situation. We also use it in the sense of authentic. So we might say someone, kind of going back to a tradition of Harry Frankfurt, someone is highly autonomous if they follow kind of desires or judgments that they've reflected on and endorsed themselves. And then finally, there's a sense of being autonomous as kind of acting for good reasons. You're autonomous if you're able to kind of perceive what's the practically or morally best thing to do in a situation and act. So which of these should we pick? And in particular, which of these should we pick to kind of think about AI in the workplace? So here we adopt a kind of method from Wolf and Deschalet in their book, City of Equals. So they were interested in this question, what is a good city? Where they think that's distinct from these general questions about what is a kind of just basic institution, what is a good political system, economy. They're like, what is a good city? To think about this kind of situated question, what they want is, or what they kind of do is they start with existing policies, existing problems, and existing solutions that are identified by some sample populace. So they might go to different cities, look at the different kinds of policies, problems that people have articulated, solutions that they have, and then kind of combine those to generate a more abstract account of what is it to be a good city in context C, where a context might be indexed to geographic location, time, culture, all of those things. And I think this is well suited to these kind of situated moral questions where we want to start off with a kind of rich knowledge of what's actually the case, and then theorize about kind of relevant values like goodness or wrongness from that knowledge. Okay, I keep doing this. So I think one difficulty in using this method to think about AI is there's some policy, right? Not a ton of policy, but there's some policy. There's not a lot applied to work specifically. Oftentimes we don't have a good sense of what are the existing problems even, so we just lack the basic data about how is AI being used, what are the problems, what do people think the problems are, and we certainly don't have solutions, clear identified solutions. So we thought, let's start with kind of a more basic step of thinking about how do we gather information about what do people think are the problems that AI poses to their autonomy at work, what are potential solutions, and how do they think about autonomy? So right at first we thought, well, perhaps you do a good old survey, right? You ask people questions like on a scale of 1 to 10, how autonomous are you in the workplace? Advantages of large numbers of people, kind of interpersonally variable data, these kind of things. I think this wouldn't be well suited to our approach because oftentimes these surveys, right, you first say, what is autonomy, right? You come up with a scale, you validate the scale, and then you measure. But our question is, how do people think about autonomy and how AI is impacting it? So it seems like a more kind of open-ended method is called for. Maybe you could have a survey that's like open text, but not something that's seeking to measure a particular value. We also have the kind of survey methods tend to be pretty limited. They mostly use data from national surveys. So you might think, well, here is exactly the kind of situation where qualitative research is helpful. Qualitative research helps to unearth people's subjective understandings of their work and what matters to them. But it can be really hard to do at scale. It's just very time-consuming, right? Costly. So we thought we would try out an approach that was piloted by 2 colleagues of mine at the LSE, and a number of other people have done as well, I'm sure at this point. So they basically open sourced the procedure for building an AI chatbot to interview people at scale. So these are, you could chat GPT, Claude, pick your kind of large language model powered chatbot of choice. Use that, set up a little interview platform that people can go on, and have them conduct an automated interview. So this has a few advantages, I think. It's easy to do at scale. It's more responsive than a survey. And as we've seen, right, AI agents are kind of capable of mimicking characters. So I'll say what I mean by that and get into the kind of details of the pilot study. So in the pilot study, we were looking at the following 3 research questions. First, what characteristics of good work are most important for people? Second, how do people conceptualize autonomy at work? And third, how do people experience the impacts of AI on their autonomy at work? So can we kind of pull out any themes or commonalities across their experience? So the interview setup was as follows. We had 40 IT professionals and data scientists that were recruited through Prolific. This is a platform by which you can recruit survey participants. So people sign up to Prolific, they get paid to do certain tasks, including interviews, and then Prolific charges a fee for kind of matching you with participants on the basis of some criteria that you've set up. They were targeted through their domain expertise and their work functions. They consented to a 30-minute interview by ChatGPT. In particular, they knew that OpenAI would have access to all of the data of the transcript. And it's relevant because we've been kind of iterating on this pilot. Not all of the research participants face the same automated interviewer. So the kind of results I'm going to present, they've kind of collated across basically 3 different rounds of interviews, but not everyone got the same kind of rough structure of questions. So part of the point was to kind of test out what structure of questions helps best answer these research questions we're interested in. Okay, so we also, did a kind of iterative development of the prompt, as I mentioned. So this was based on themes that came out of past interviews, a wide range of positive and negative impacts, as well as how successful the system was at drawing out rich particular experiences. Okay. So here's the most recent prompt. I've shortened it in order to just have it all fit on one slide. But again, this is the kind of how we prompted the chatbot in order to conduct these interviews. So it says, you're a professor at one of the world's leading research universities, specializing in qualitative research methods with focus on conducting interviews, little character. In the following, you'll conduct an interview with a human respondent to find out their experience of autonomy at work and how that's been impacted by AI. So then the interview has some structure, right? The chatbot is asked to kind of follow this rough structure. So to start out with the question, in your view, what are the core characteristics of a good job? In general, not necessarily your job. Then talk about this for kind of 3 to 5 questions, draw out the top characteristics, get more detail about them. Then part 2, studying how AI is impacting their autonomy. So we'll now move on to the topic of autonomy. Can you give me an example of how AI is impacting your autonomy at work? And then there are kind of 4 phases, right? The first 3 are asking about particular examples. So asking kind of 5 or 6 follow-up questions about this particular example to really drill down into the experience. And then the chatbot is prompted, make sure you ask about control over how you work, since this is a kind of major theme within the social sciences, and ask about skills and how people's skills have changed, because this is a kind of focus of a lot of, for example, the economics literature or policy. And then part 3, right, ending by asking people to reflect on their own concept of autonomy. So starting off with reflecting on those experiences, what in your view are the core characteristics of an autonomous job? Again, in general, not necessarily your job, and then ask around 4 to 5 follow-up questions to draw that out. So some preliminary results and then the question. Okay. So the methodology we followed for this was kind of 4 steps. So iteratively develop a code book. So read through the interviews, kind of start off coding individual interviews with certain topics that came up. After having read through all of them, go back based on the kind of comparison across interviews, refine the code book. On the basis of those codings, kind of look for higher order themes that emerged across the different interviews. And then also look for patterns across experiences and clusters that might help define a conception of autonomy across someone, and then also highlight divergent cases. So I think this is where qualitative research is, of course, one of the many ways in which it's particularly strong. So you said that there's a theme, but of course, oftentimes for each theme, there would be people disagreeing, right? Kind of these divergent cases where people said, actually, I don't use AI because I'm worried it's going to undermine my skills. So highlight those kind of disagreements. And then what we did very, again, preliminarily is compare this against an AI analysis using the above methodology to see where did our analysis and the AI diverge as a way, I guess, also to kind of test how good was the AI analysis. So I'm just going to focus on 2 and 3 what follows here. So 5 themes that we saw. There was an emphasis on what we might call skill shift rather than skill change. An emphasis on increased efficiency and quality, but still requiring human validation. A huge emphasis, which actually really surprised me, on more time outside of work and greater work-life balance. This was a major theme for people, a kind of advantage of AI. A 4th theme was using AI to do new tasks or kind of learn and upskill, with some worries about de-skilling, so we saw both. And a theme that it really mattered whether it was people's choice or whether there was a kind of external imposition. Okay. So it's a skill shift rather than skill change. So I've just pasted in some places examples from the interviews, also so you get a sense of the kind of questions that the AI chatbot is asking. So you can tell this is a chatbot because it says, that's very interesting. Could you tell me more about how you've shifted your skill focus and the impact that it's had on your day-to-day tasks? And the person says, AI has saved us time on more mundane and routine aspects of work, freed up time to train or develop higher level skills such as project management, analysis of processes, and communication skills. So we can spend more time on the design of solutions, improving user friendliness, and perfecting workflows. And this was very common across participants that by using AI, if you're able to use AI to kind of do more routine tasks, you have time for these other tasks, like often human-centered tasks. So managing people, kind of communicating with your team, communicating with clients, finding out what they need. Also this kind of higher level strategic thinking that people also seem to enjoy shifting to. So a major theme as well was people saw a greater efficiency and quality, but is still requiring human validation. So this person says, now we can review our code changes in seconds, although we still review the AI response in case there are any issues. And this came up kind of constantly. People said, look, I can't just take the AI and use its output automatically. It always needs some kind of human verification, but it's still making it more efficient. A third one, again, major focus for people, more time outside of work and greater work-life balance. So people said it has increased my freedom. I have more time to do other tasks, given me more time with my family as I don't have to spend hours replying to email. Great. There was some emphasis as well about using AI to learn or to kind of do new tasks. Not sure whether you should call it upskilling, because there was a kind of two sorts of cases. One sort of case where people said, I'm actively using AI to learn and gain new skills. And one case where people said, I'm using AI to do new things, but they didn't talk about it in a way that you would read it as they felt like they were gaining new skills. They're just able to do a new range of tasks, but they don't explicitly talk about learning new skills. So these were two different kinds of cases that I've grouped under this heading. This person explicitly says it's allowed more junior members to be more useful, so they can be influential. You know, it's kind of helped us generally. It led to better solutions. This, I think, resonates with some of the kind of hope in, or the kind of initial studies of generative AI, that it provides the biggest performance boost to the lowest performance workers. So if you're kind of on the lower scale of performance, like maybe you're more junior, you'll get a comparatively bigger boost compared to someone who's more of an expert. But people were worried very actively about de-skilling. So one person said, I just avoid AI altogether. It's important to me to maintain control and use traditional methods. Another tried AI, but decided not to use it. They thought it's better if I have full control over the work, as they put it. And the third abandoned AI to restore what you might call a kind of creative autonomy. So someone said, I just noticed myself becoming lazy, losing skills, becoming less creative. So I had to stop using generative AI and go back to just doing everything myself. So in general, it was this choice to use AI or not to use AI that was autonomy enhancing for people. This is the fifth theme. So again, it's worth emphasizing, these are coders who tended not to report much kind of like algorithmic management or external surveillance. When they did, they found it to be autonomy undermining. So someone said, AI is kind of impacting my job. I'm constantly surveilled. It's horrible. I'm kind of totally lost my autonomy at work. Another example, someone said, you know, I'm an IT expert and a bunch of people in my workplace are now using generative AI to challenge my own expertise. And this is autonomy undermining for me, because people, so there's this one case of someone who was like, I was in a meeting, you know, I presented what we're going to do for something, and someone raised their hand and was like, oh, but couldn't we do it cheaper this way? And the person said, oh, no, we actually checked that out with my team and we can't do it. And the person who questioned them said, no, but I asked Claude, and Claude said you could do it. And they just very insistently were like, no, you were able to. And finally, the person had to say, okay, I'll go away and I'll double check that. So they felt, you know, my autonomy is really being undermined because my expertise is being questioned in the face of people who think they've gained kind of new skills, but in fact are misled and are not able to know that they're misled. Okay. So now I'll talk a little bit about the themes about good work and autonomous work that came out of this, and then wrap up with some questions I'm eager to hear your input on, as well as general questions and criticisms. Okay. So on the themes of good work and autonomous work, here I want to flag, we added in questions for only 10 people in this pilot about autonomous work. So this was something that just very recently I realized we ought to add explicitly, or would be interesting to test. And about 20 people have had a question about good work. And then I also did an activity here that some of you were at about good work, and I haven't had the chance. I may have included some very preliminary things, but I have a little bit of on this, and I want to include it as well. So when you ask people, again, these are the 20 people who got a question, 20 data analysts and IT experts in the UK were asked, what is good work to you? The top 3 things that came up were compensation or financial security. I think it was something like 100%, like basically everyone mentioned this in their top 3. Work-life balance and flexibility were most frequently either second or third for people. And I think this fits with people's emphasis on AI has made me more autonomous because I can have a greater work-life balance and be more flexible. Second or third was some kind of interesting, engaging, meaningful work. And then there were a bunch of other things that made it into people's top 5, but weren't the kind of top 3 when you collated all the answers. So some kind of positive work environment or culture was often somewhere between people's 3rd, 4th, or 5th top characteristics of good work. Growth and learning opportunities, some kind of job security and stability. Recognition also came up for some people, but much less so, and it would generally be kind of near the bottom of the list. Autonomy was very rarely mentioned. So people mentioned it when we asked them at the end about autonomy, of course, but I think for like, I need to go back and look at this. It was like 1 or maybe 2 people explicitly said autonomy. And it was often at the end of the list if they did mention it. So if they were asked, what is a good job, some kind of freedom, independence, autonomy rarely came up. Even though, interestingly, right, you might have worried, well, people were super primed to name autonomy. Because at the beginning, when they had to sign the consent form, we said, this next is an experiment from doctors Kate Vredenburgh and Marco Meyer. It's about autonomy. They're going to talk to you using an AI chatbot about autonomy. And you consent to the data being thus and so. And so you might have worried, like, oh, people had kind of autonomy on their minds, so maybe this was a priming effect. But interestingly, it very rarely came up. So I only started here what we talked about, but just some kind of themes. Maybe just to say there seemed to be kind of broad agreement, right? Compensation came up for people when we had the activity in Taipei. Producing value and avoiding harm. Also being valued, a kind of respect and recognition. Working environment. We also had, similar to this, growth and learning opportunities. So people stress some kind of achievements, kind of ability to learn, grow. So kind of broadly similar, I think, emphases. Okay, so now this question, what is autonomy? And here I kind of base the preliminary analysis both on when we ask people, what do you think autonomy is? But then also what kind of experiences that they share when we ask them how is your autonomy been affected? And I think here, for me, what was most notable is that people were really kind of divided between 2 big ideas. So one was a conception that really centers on what we might call independence and self-directedness, and a conception centering on something like having expertise or some kind of authority within relations of trust, mutual dependence, and answerability to other people. So oftentimes when asked about what autonomy is, people mention some kind of independence and self-directedness. So something like a high level of independence on how to work, what to work on, freedom to make decisions, ability to work without someone micromanaging you, the ability to kind of work on your own, make decisions on your own, kind of for independence and self-directedness. Uh-oh, PDF error. Okay, well, I can talk about this. So this is the kind of first thing was what I expected. So something like people saying it's important for me to be independent, have freedom, be self-directed, not be micromanaged. But there is a whole big theme when we ask people, like, what is your idea of autonomy, as well as when we ask people about their experiences of autonomy, one a huge thing that came up is being trusted. So autonomy is being trusted by other people to kind of execute a certain task and then being relied on by them. Another big theme in this area was answerability. So being autonomous is being independent to do a task, but in such a way that you're the one who's kind of on the hook. You're answerable to others. You have the kind of authority over the task, but on the flip side, you're answerable. Another big one we saw was, again, being seen as kind of an expert. So being autonomous is being seen as someone who has a valuable input on a question, and that this might be undermined by AI. So, you know, this is what we might think of as maybe a more kind of relational conception of autonomy, that autonomy is standing in relations with other people of trust and answerability, being seen as an expert, rather than just being kind of independent, atomistic, or self-sufficient. So what did AI pull out of, specifically Claude Sonnet 4.5, pull out of this? So it said there were these kind of 6 conceptions of autonomy that people used. One was decision-making authority, so just being the one who had some kind of authority over a decision. A big one as well was this kind of method control, the methods used to work, control over your own time, independence from oversight, this kind of freedom, ownership and accountability, which I just mentioned. And then, so I was puzzled that Claude said AI delegation was a facet of autonomy. I think it was because people did often say, delegating to AI has made me more autonomous, when they were able to delegate tasks to AI that were kind of more menial or routine, and when they had control over when to delegate AI. I wouldn't say that's the kind of conception of autonomy. I would say that's a kind of way in which you might exercise your autonomy, or for some people, they're kind of made more autonomous by doing this. But anyway, Claude wanted to include it on this list. Okay. So section 5, and then I'll just kind of list some questions and then wrap up and get all of your feedback and criticism. So I think it's a real question, how troubled should I be as a philosopher pursuing this project about how autonomy didn't really make people's list, right? When you asked about what is a good job, and you asked about the top 5 characteristics, autonomy didn't make the top 5 for most people. And right, you might think that bears on some normative questions, potentially. So you might ask, you know, ought autonomy be important in the workplace? Is autonomy really as important as has been stressed? And this relates to a kind of methodological question that we find, you know, in philosophy of science, feminist philosophy, normative ethics. We see some kind of practice, or we see people's expressed values. Do we defer to the practice and do our best to make sense of it? Or do we, from a normative standpoint, kind of critique the practice or explain some kind of fault, or the reason why we see the practice, but that we wouldn't under more ideal conditions? The one thing you might worry is, well, considering the state of the world, right? People just generally feel a huge loss of control. People feel a huge political loss of control. People feel a huge loss of control over their housing, over their jobs, over the way politics will go, their social lives, right? Maybe this de-emphasis of autonomy is just that people have given up. People have kind of identified autonomy with control, and they've given up on that. They're like, best case, I get some security, but I'm not going to get autonomy. Okay. So now some kind of questions about the methodology. So one thing I think is kind of brought me to this and really interests me, I have no idea how to conceptualize what we're doing. So, you know, in the social sciences, there's a big qualitative and quantitative divide. Where does this fall? So I think for many qualitative researchers, this doesn't fall on the qualitative side. qualitative research involves a bunch of things that's totally absent from this. So maybe you might say, you know, this is a kind of large scale data, but it's not kind of qualitative research as we know it. From the quantitative side, you might say, well, it's kind of lacking a rigorous setup that would allow us to kind of interpersonally compare the results from these different interviews. So it's not particularly good data in that sense either. Is this basically like a more responsive survey? Do we want to call it an interview? I'm not sure. And just relatedly, could AI have the skills of a good qualitative researcher? So things like asking non-directive questions or not making evaluative statements. So a thing that we had to work on was, there was one kind of round where, so oftentimes I would just kind of test the chatbot myself before deploying it, because you don't want to waste a lot of money if it's not performing particularly well. And we had a real problem with the chatbot always being like, I can see that that's really difficult for you, or that must be so hard. It's exactly what you want to avoid in qualitative research. You don't want to be putting a kind of normative or affective lens on what someone is telling you, especially if they didn't bring it up themselves. So if someone just says, oh yeah, I'm working long hours, and then, you know, Claude says, that must be so hard for you, right? This is not great, putting a kind of explicit lens on their experience. Also asking non-directive questions. So, right, the idea is we're trying to elicit people's own conceptions of autonomy. We don't want to be like, so autonomy defined as control over your working method is what we're going to ask about. What do you think autonomy is, right? This would be bad if someone, you know, in the course of the interview, ChatGPT explicitly defined autonomy for participants. Another thing you want is to draw out concrete experiences. So we really want kind of rich experiences of how people are being impacted that we can use to theorize. A good qualitative researcher can follow up on surprising points, omissions, or tensions. So things like noticing what someone didn't say and then asking about those, or noticing a kind of tension in what someone said, as well as drawing out difficult or sensitive experiences. And again, I think, you know, something that will help the kind of progress of the paper. A lot of interesting research in psychology is coming out about the different ways in which people interact with chatbots versus human, say therapists, friends, etc. It's not always clear that on these metrics we're going to get a clear kind of human-based advantage. So there's some initial research, for example, that people tend to kind of share very vulnerable or kind of intimate secrets with chatbots, using it in a kind of therapy context in a way that they're actually a bit more hesitant when they're face-to-face with a person. A major problem, kind of unrelated to this core skills, is just kind of getting very noisy data. So, you know, we've recruited a bunch of people on Prolific using AI to interview them. But of course, an easy way to make a lot of money would just be someone has Claude in the background, puts in the questions to Claude, pastes it into our little interview chatbot, and then gets their, you know, $20 or whatever. So there's a major problem, which is like, we're assuming good faith that people are answering these questions truthfully in light of their own experience. That might be wrong, right? I mean, it's not my sense of what's happening, and I think, like, I would really love to also be able to ask people at the end of the interview, how was the experience of this interview for you? People seem maybe really interested in doing this because they tend to give kind of long and detailed answers and engage pretty well with the chatbot. We haven't gotten anyone being insulting, like, that was a stupid question, you're just a chatbot, what are you doing? Something like that. So, but it's always very possible. So I think one kind of approach you might take is, you know, work with companies, workers' unions to kind of directly recruit people for this kind of work. And then maybe you might think they have the incentive to fill it out more truthfully. All right. And then finally, kind of thinking about the interview design questions that I would love your feedback on. So one question is, are we measuring the right thing? So is this a kind of normatively important target? So of course, in these qualitative interviews, we're getting people's conceptualization of autonomy, which I think is interesting and important, but we're also getting their own experience of autonomy. This is, of course, distinct from their autonomy. So you might say people might experience themselves as having high autonomy, but by some kind of objective measures actually have very low autonomy. Interestingly, so I have the kind of last point on the slide. There's a divide between coders' experience and facts about work. We have some initial evidence that this is the case. So there's a study, I can send the citation if anyone is interested, where they looked at people's self-reports of how quickly they did a coding task using AI and a measurement of how quickly they did the coding task. They were totally different. People thought they were way faster than they were. So people often thought, I'm going to be faster with AI, and then they weren't. They just felt like things were faster. They experienced it as faster. I think it's a really interesting factor, right? So it's an open question when it comes to this interview and people are saying, I have a better work-life balance, I have a lot more time. Do they actually have more time? Or do they just not have more time, but they feel like more repressed in the time that they have? So an alternative is they feel like they have more time because they've automated all the boring work that made them super tired after they finish their job. They finish their job at the same time, but they're like, oh, great. Now I'm able to go out and see friends or, engage with my kids well or do all of these kind of tasks, but they're actually working the same hours. We don't know on the basis of what we've been told. One possibility that I'm open to is actually it's the experience of autonomy that's important, that maybe people are right that like autonomy itself is not that important, but experiencing some kind of control in the workplace is important for people. It's psychologically important. But actually having autonomy, like actually having control over your work, isn't all that important. So that's one kind of possibility, that the experience of autonomy is important for people. It doesn't make their top list of what a good job is, because having autonomy is not that important, and maybe even the experience of it, it's important, but it's maybe not as important as these other things to people. So another question, is this actually an insightful population of workers to study? So as always in social science, there's who's easy to study and who's insightful to study, and oftentimes these come apart, right? These are UK workers who are already on Prolific, who are easy to recruit. Is this an interesting population of people? I think one reason it's maybe interesting, like at this exact moment, is there's been a lot of other research on coders using generative AI. So this can kind of draw on all this other research. You might also think maybe it's interesting because they're more likely to use AI. They're likely to know more about AI, so it's kind of easier to interview them. So oftentimes a problem in interviewing people about AI is AI can mean so many things, and people don't know when their workplace is using AI. So say that you work for 7-Eleven and you get your schedule each week, right? I ask you, do you use AI in your work, or does AI affect your work? And someone says no. And then I say, well, do they use an automated system for scheduling your shifts? Do they change week to week? And then the person says, oh, yeah. And so you say, okay, so AI is impacting your work, right? But it's very hard for workers, oftentimes because bosses are not upfront about this, to even know when AI is being used. And interestingly, I think I would have thought that kind of this was a population that puts a high value on autonomy. And so again, seeing it not stressed is kind of interesting. Okay. So a final question for you all I'm interested to discuss. So Yingtung and I already started talking about this. So a thing I worry about is using this theoretically loaded term autonomy in the interview. So would it be better just to ask, what is a good job for you? How is AI impacting your job? And then see if people's experiences kind of connect with autonomy. So you might say, well, it would be better if we didn't use this loaded term autonomy that will have a lot of different resonances for different people. And there's this question of, if you want to run this, I've said I want to run this in Germany, I'd like to run it in Japan, I'd like to run it in Taiwan. How do we translate this term across all these different geographies? And might we translate it in different ways so that we just get different results based on what I was asking people about? So this is another kind of worry that you might have. And for what it's worth, I don't think they messaged me, but so I presented this in Japan, and my colleagues were like, yeah, it's not straightforward to translate autonomy in a way that would connect with people's work. Like the more straightforward way to translate autonomy, they had guessed that many people would say like, no, I don't have autonomy in my work. It's more connected to like rule of law and kind of rights under the rule of law. But they're like, maybe if you use agency, people would be more likely to say like, oh yeah, I have some agency in my work, or I have some kind of influence in my work. All right, the end. Thank you very much.
Okay, as part of our seminar tradition, we will first have a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back to QA session.